Hey guys, we are back with another online devotion, and we just managed to try and get my household quieted. My son is downstairs playing Fortnite with a friend, and even though I am removed from him by an entire level of our house, the noise he makes when he plays that game with his buddy tends to creep up the airways, the ducts in our house. So anyway, it should be relatively good at this point. So before we get started, as per usual, I'm going to grab my guitar from over here and do a song. Reach back for another oldie but a goodie. This one is, I forgot to look up the date. It was a Matt Redman original, so I'm going to guess that it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1996. That's my best guess. So, oh, and I forgot I was going to go ahead and pop over here to my computer really quick and share what is going on with the world. Maybe. Oh, there we go. All right, and done. So, yeah. Let me turn my volume down over here so that I can see what's going on. Here. Oh, maybe not. Sorry, get myself all turned around here. Let me try this. Let's see if this does the trick. Maybe. So, yeah. I'll tell you what, I know that I shared it, so I will pop over here and check on comments some other time later. So, here we go. Without further ado, Matt Redman's Better Is One Day. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. My soul longs and even faints for you. For here my heart is satisfied taste and I've seen. Come once again to me. I will draw near to you. I will draw near to you. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts, thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. So better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts, thousands elsewhere. And thousands elsewhere. All right, moving along to the devotional portion of our time together today. As per usual, I am working through this book, What Did Jesus Ask? A book full of short devotions that focus in on the questions that Jesus actually asked the people around him during the time of his ministry. And we are only, probably a third of the way through, maybe a fourth, somewhere in there, of this book. So it's been great so far. Today, the devotion is written in this book by a woman named Minerva G. Carcaño. I think I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but it's okay. She is a leader in the Methodist Church, and so that is the person who is responsible for some of the thoughts I'm going to share with you today. We're going to talk about feasting and fasting. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 2. There's a question that Jesus asks of the people who are conversing with him about the lack of fasting that they see in Jesus and in his disciples compared to some other religious folks in that day. The question is, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast when he is with them? So for the full context, Mark chapter 2, just a few verses today, just 3 verses, 18 through 20. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast." Now, it's important to note right up front that in Mark's gospel, what we just read today, this question about fasting that's brought to Jesus about why he and his disciples are not fasting, and yet these other religious folks are, it follows right immediately on the heels of the story of Jesus eating dinner. He's eating dinner at the home of one of his newest disciples, a man named Levi. And Levi was friends with a bunch of, as the text says, tax collectors and sinners. So Jesus, just before what we read, was at this essentially a party, a festive environment where he was eating, sharing table fellowship with Levi, and we assume the rest of his existing disciples, along with some people that would have been thought less of in his day, the tax collectors and the sinners. And of course, there's a question from the same religious type group, what are you doing? How dare you eat with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus responds, if you know the story, with this line, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I came to call not the righteous, but sinners." So Jesus has already revealed that he would use meals to communicate a sense of inclusion and community. So we shouldn't be surprised when he now talks about a bridegroom and what we'll unpack as being like a wedding reception. And this is especially true for people who feel left out and judged. When Jesus says he comes not for the sick, not for the healthy, but the sick, those folks he was with, they weren't necessarily physically ill, but they were socially and relationally and spiritually ill. And so Jesus comes to seek and serve and love them. So in her devotion, Minerva Carqueño reveals this story that is relevant to the topic at hand. She says, "When I was a child, nothing delighted me quite like a visit from our pastor during our family meals. Sometimes our pastor came for Sunday lunch, sometimes for birthday parties, sometimes even on Thanksgiving Day. My family was a faithful church-going family, but not what was considered a prominent family in the church. We were a poor family living on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Texas, subsisting on picking cotton, packing fruit and vegetables for shipment at the local produce company, at best working the lowest wage entry-level jobs. Prominence, even at our church, required money and social status, neither of which we had. So when our pastor came to share a meal with us, our lives were transformed from insignificance to being special. Even as a child, I understood that our pastor was a representative of God, and I could feel the presence of God as our pastor came to be with us. My grandmother, Sophia, and my mother, Rebecca, would fast during religious holidays, but not when this visitor would come. The best food we had would be prepared in abundance, no one thinking about what we'd eat the next day. We would sit for hours at that dining room table, enjoying the food, but even more, enjoying the presence of this pastor who told us stories of faith, making them come alive. He would ask about our lives, always assuring us that we were not alone because God was with us. We would laugh at life struggles and at our own frailties because, after all, God loved us just as we were, and God was on our side." I come from a different tradition than this wonderful bishop, Minerva. She comes from Methodism, and I come from a Quaker heritage. And so I don't necessarily resonate with the idea of the pastor being that representative of God type person, although I appreciate the sentiment. My heritage within Quakerism would say that every follower of Jesus has the opportunity to bring the presence of Jesus even into the most basic of conversations and even the modest of meals. But I love the picture of that meal being a place where there was a sense of inclusion, a sense of community, especially for a family that apparently felt in some ways definitely separated out and different from the rest of that church. See if I read this part yet. Oh, no. So she talked about that, and then she talked about how with Jesus it would have been even more incredible. What my family experienced with this pastor, was but a fraction of what those who received Jesus into their homes must have felt when he came among them to share a meal, to share life, and to share a blessing. Now, one thing, though, to keep in mind is that she relays this story and says that news of this sort of visitation by her pastor was not necessarily celebrated within her church community. And she basically says the bottom line was, why would the pastor waste his time with us? Shouldn't he have been praying, studying the Bible, preparing for a sermon, or fasting instead of feasting with the likes of us? And this is the theme that I think we find here in this short passage in Mark chapter 2. This theme of fasting versus the feasting that is inherent in Jesus talking about a bridegroom and a wedding type celebration. So John's disciples were being properly religious by fasting. The Pharisees, we're told in this passage, were being properly religious by fasting. So the question became, why is this component of being properly religious missing in the lives of Jesus and his followers? Now, as a really short side note, we won't get into it, but elsewhere in the Gospels you can read about Jesus talking about fasting and actually rebuking some folks who had less than genuine attitudes and appearances that went along with fasting. And he talks about when you fast, put oil on your face so that you kind of hide it. So it's something that you don't do just for the attention of others. It's important also to note that Jesus doesn't reject entirely the idea of fasting. His full answer shows that there's a proper time for it. He says there will come a time when they will no longer have the bridegroom, and they will have a time of fasting. But his answer via question, the question of how can we fast when the bridegroom is still with us? It uses that metaphor of a wedding. You can catch it because of the mention of the bridegroom. It's a metaphor of a wedding. How can the guests at a wedding reception fast during a feast? There's a quote. Maybe I already read this one. Oh, no, this is the one I still want to read. She puts it this way. It would be as if we were fasting while at a wedding that was going on. If we fasted at a wedding reception, wouldn't the message be that we were not pleased by the wedding? Wouldn't it be a sign that perhaps we don't approve of the wedding or maybe even of the marriage? So I'm looking forward to, in just a few short months, my friends Beth and Mike are going to be getting married, and they're going to get married. There's going to be a reception, and it is going to be a fantastic celebration. And I cannot imagine sitting at one of those reception tables in the banquet hall, sort of crossing my arms and refusing to participate in the feasting that is going on, because I would be sending a silent message that I was giving some sort of disapproval to the couple, to the marriage, to all of that. And so that's part of Jesus' question is, if you are in the middle of a time and a place and a season where you can be rejoicing, this attitude of feasting, then certainly it's not a time for fasting. And of course, Jesus is saying this understanding that his physical presence there with his disciples during his earthly ministry was such a time of rejoicing, such a time of feasting for those people who got to interact with Jesus in those really intimate ways. So I wonder too, as I was reading through this and making some notes, I wonder if this whole answer Jesus gives is sort of a callback to the preceding passage that I mentioned, where Jesus was eating with a group of people, right? And there were those religious folks who came up and basically criticized him for eating with them. So I just wonder, Jesus, the bridegroom, was feasting with a group of people in that earlier passage. Now, it was people that were not approved of people, but Jesus was feasting with a group of people, and the religious folks standing at a distance were essentially fasting. They were withholding themselves from that meal while also judging what was happening at that celebratory, festive meal environment. So I wonder if these are more connected together than we realize, that Jesus is talking about this festive meal and about how there's a time for rejoicing, and that by standing back at a distance and fasting, that there is a sense of judgment, basically, that's happening there. So anyway, put that somewhere else. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. They're linked so closely in proximity. It just makes sense to me. But I'm going to finish up by saying this. There are many possible takeaways from this passage, but one of them I think is this: our feasting and our fasting can be equally religious experiences, equally religious. Jesus was being made to feel as if he and his disciples were less religious because they were not following along with the rites and the rituals that went along with being religious at the time. And I think Jesus' answer reveals something completely different. John's disciples and the Pharisees were doing a legitimately valuable and obedient thing in their fasting, assuming it was done with the right motives and the right posture. And again, Jesus clearly says that there is a time for fasting for those who follow him. But our practice of religion does not have to be limited to just rites and rituals like fasting. And this is, again, where my sort of friends Quaker heritage comes out, and the concept within Quakerism is that all of life is sacramental, that in all of life you can have these experiences of the presence of God, that the presence of God is not limited to rites and rituals like something like fasting, but it's much wider, much broader than that. And we find agreement with that in passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Whether you eat or drink, or I would say, or refrain from eating or drinking. Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. There's this invitation within, at least my understanding of this theology, that you can invite the glory and the presence of God into just about anything, feasting or fasting. That religiosity is not narrowly defined by some of these rites and rituals that people have the ability to do. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, bad, or evil, but it means that we, I think, unnecessarily limit things that Jesus is teaching us. Maybe we don't need to. So I will close by saying this. I'm convinced that Jesus considered his meal with Levi and his friends a meal during which he not only shared food and drink with them, but also shared himself and shared the healing that he was administering to those socially, spiritually, and relationally sick people as that caring physician among the sick. I think he considered that meal to be just as religious as the experience of fasting that was being done by the Pharisees in this passage. I think there was a desire by some people to draw a line in the sand between this thing and that thing, and this is good and valuable and obedient and fruitful, and this thing maybe isn't. And Jesus sort of breaks that line down and invites us to look at both our feasting and our fasting as opportunities to invite the glory and the presence of God to be with us, among us, and really to be a source of healing for all of those who need healing from the various sicknesses, because we all come to God in need for one thing or another. So that is all that I want to share with you today. Glad you guys could join me. Sorry I didn't have the comments pulled up. My computer kind of failed me a little bit there. But I will, after I get done with this video, I will hop on the computer, and if there's any questions or comments, I'd be glad to interact with you guys there in the comments. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.